My name is Joe Volkmer, and the topic I chose to talk about for this video lecture is the case of Proclamations. The case of Proclamations is an English court case from 1610. It was presided over and ruled on by Sir Edward Coke, who is pictured here to the right. At the time, he was the Chief Justice of Common Pleas and was considered a servant to the Crown. What was being ruled on was the legitimacy of recent proclamations levied by King James I in an attempt to circumvent Parliament in the creation and implementation of new law. It existed within the climate of tension between King James, who was a very authoritarian ruler, as he attempted to navigate an English population that increasingly desired greater representation through Parliament. The proclamations on trial were in two different domains, the first of which being the erection of new buildings in London. This was addressed twice by King James, once in 1603 and once in 1605. And the second dealing with starch production from wheat, and this was addressed in 1607 via proclamation. King James felt that these needed to be addressed this way due to Parliament's perceived inability to adequately address it on their own. He invoked ideas of salus populi, which is the idea that the welfare of the people is the supreme law of the land, and that as long as the proclamations could be justified as being pursuant to the interest of the common good, then they were legitimate actions for a monarch to take. It is important to note that King James I was an ardent defender and believer in divine right to rule, and so he believed that he shouldn't be held responsible by Parliament because he is only held responsible by God. And so the way that he justified these proclamations with common good was, he said, the erection of new buildings in London could potentially lead to overpopulation, and overpopulation carried the risk of spreading plague and was a fire hazard, and that increasing starch production emitted a noxious odor in the surrounding area and was also potentially leading to a risk of food shortages in the country. Coke, however, rejected this rationalization and rescinded the proclamations levied by King James. This wasn't necessarily done because he didn't agree with the justification of the law, but rather he principally disagreed with the idea that a monarch could unilaterally create law or prohibit behaviors that were previously legal. The way he defined English law was statutory laws, which needed to be created and implemented by Parliament, common law, which came from judicial precedent and came from the courts, and then customs that were national and local. However, his ruling was largely ignored by King James, who continued to try to rule via proclamation alone without the consent of Parliament. While James's decision to resist its implementation certainly suppressed the immediate impact that the case of proclamations had, it didn't nullify its importance. And what was really represented was an anti-royalist sentiment that was growing in England. The factions of royalists who still believed in some semblance of an absolute monarchy and divine right, and parliamentarians that believed in representation of the people in government, showed that there was sort of this inexorable trend towards conflict between these two factions, and this would ultimately culminate in a civil war that lasted from 1642 until 1651. The ruling continued a trend challenging absolute monarchy and was a foundation and laid a foundation for Enlightenment thinking. Philosophers such as John Locke would build off of these pillars and espouse ideas of separations of power and restraint on government action, and these ideas continue to shape Western thought on legitimate government to this day. I chose this subject for this project because I have an interest in constitutional law. There's an obvious overlap between British and American political philosophy, given the fact that the American system largely proceeds from British British political philosophers. And so Coke's ruling that placed constraints on the unilateral power of the monarch and eventually inspired their British Constitution and the British Bill of Rights. These ideas are applied to the US president today, given how they inspired the US Constitution and the US Bill of Rights. It's no secret that there's a growing trend towards the centralization of power in the executive branch here in America. And the same way that Edward Coke was worried about royal proclamations and illegitimate government, there's a conversation brewing about the use of executive orders in America and whether that's a legitimate rule of government. In order to properly understand why our system thinks the way it does about legitimate ruling and legitimate government, you need to have a proper understanding of these foundational documents that paved the way for the government structure that we have today. And for similar reasons, I think it's important for everybody to learn about the case of proclamations. The establishment that law cannot be unilaterally created is not something that's granted. It was fought for by judges and revolutionaries alike. And while it's true that similar sentiments guided the American founders, and that its reasoning is inseparable from American constitutionalism, the ideas don't defend themselves. They need to be fought for by the people occupying the system. In a beautifully succinct way, Sir Edward Coke said in the case of proclamations that the king has no prerogative but that which the law of the land allows him. And that's an idea that I think everybody needs to keep in mind as they fight against tyrannical government encroachment.